Good morning. This is the Saturday morning interview. My name is Geoffrey Onditi. In 1970, Norman Borlaug traveled to Norway, the land of his ancestors, to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize for enhancing agricultural productivity in the 20th century. More than any other single person of this age, he has helped provide bread for a hungry world. This is what the Nobel Committee said in presenting him with the Peace Prize. We have made this choice in the hope that providing bread will also give the world peace. He was the father of the 20th century Green Revolution that saved a billion lives from starvation. Norman Borlaug died in 2009. Borlaug's legacy will stay on for many years, and one person who is trying to promote his legacy is Julie Borlaug. Julie Borlaug is Noman Borlaug's granddaughter, and she is going around the world to ensure that farmers are given the right tools, technology, and even policies to ensure that food is available, hence a peaceful world. Today on the Saturday morning interview, I'm speaking with Julie Borlaug, Associate Director, Borlaug Institute, External Relations in Texas, USA, and we're focusing on the Borlaug legacy to the world. Welcome to Kenya, first of all, Julie.
Thank you for having me. One of my favorite places in Africa.
Yes, it looks beautiful. The sun is out today.
Yeah, we've had wonderful weather this week, so it's been great visiting.
Welcome also to our program. You are the granddaughter of Noman Borlaug, the famous Nobel laureate. Tell me the story of Noman before we go into yours.
So my grandfather was a wheat scientist, and in the 1940s, the situation in Mexico with their wheat and maize was pretty poor, and the Rockefeller Foundation, along with the Mexican government, wanted to invest in helping the Mexican farmers improve their varieties and their yields, and my grandfather was the wheat scientist who went down. Over the course of time, he was able to develop a wheat variety that was disease resistant, shorter growth rate, drier climate, and it was so when I say shorter growth rate, it was also dwarf, and it was able to have shuttle breeding, which meant it could have two seasons, so the highland and lowland, which with two seasons you could speed up the research. And it was that wheat that was taken over to Pakistan and India in the 1960s when everyone was predicting mass famine, and they became grain self-sufficient, so the two countries did not actually have to go through what a famine would cause. And it was through the window of peace, had there not been food, what would have happened between Pakistan and India, that my grandfather received the Nobel Peace Prize. Because as my grandfather said, you can cultivate justice, but at the same time you have to cultivate the fields, otherwise there will be no peace.
You have to cultivate the fields also.
Yes, you have to cultivate the fields. I think people don't realize, especially if you're from outside the rural area, the important role that agriculture, our farmers play, agricultural research and development. It was the first agriculture. It is still predominantly the most important. What do we need every day to survive? We need food and we need water, and that is agriculture.
So what really inspired your grandfather to be the great scientist that he was?
So he went to the University of Minnesota, and he was from Iowa, and when he entered the university in Minneapolis, Minnesota, it was the Great Depression. And in the United
that was in the 1930s.
Yes. He saw bread lines and riots, and he would say people with their hands out begging for 10 cents just to buy some bread. And he thought to himself, if things are this bad in the United States with all that we have, what is it like in other countries like Mexico? And that's when he decided right then and there that he was going to do something that helped less developed countries, that's what they called it at that time, but developing countries be able to feed their own people.
And then you went to Mexico after that?
Oh, he moved to Mexico in 1940.
Yes.
So he was in Mexico through 1940. He still was active in Mexico till he passed away.
When you talk about being a scientist, what did he do exactly as a scientist?
Well, one thing about him that made him unusual and successful was his tenacity. He was stubborn. He was going to persevere, and he was going to make sure that the wheat variety that he had been able to create was actually going to play a role in increasing yields and feeding people. So he had this passion and this absolute will that he could not fail, and he was always optimistic. And I think the other thing that made him great was he was empathetic. He was sympathetic to what he saw. And, when he came to Africa for the first time and he held a starving child, a child who was dying of hunger in his hands, and he looked into the eyes of that child and he said he just saw hollowness, that he knew right then and there that he had to dedicate himself to doing something more so no child ever starved again.
So that inspired him.
Well, the Great Depression was his big inspiration. His inspiration to Africa came when he had his first visit and really saw the face of famine here. He saw that in India and Pakistan and also as well in Mexico. But I think it was the human struggle, those who didn't have adequate food. That is what really inspired him. And as a scientist, he knew through technology and innovation that he could do better and he could do better for them.
And through technology, he saved 1 billion people.
Yes, they say he saved 1 billion lives, and that was throughout Asia. So if you're ever in India and Pakistan and you bring up his name, they already know it, and they will tell you that, especially some of the older population, that they are alive because of the Green Revolution.
Let's talk about yourself. Now, how did your grandfather, Norman Borlaug, inspire you?
I would say, first and foremost, his work ethic. He always told, there were 5 grandchildren, and he always told us that our education was first and foremost important because no one could take our education away from us. And I think his spirit and I already talked about his strong will, he always said that there was no place for mediocrity and that you had to do your best. And I think he really put that into everything that we did growing up. But I think for me, I had always worked in the nonprofit sector before I started working for my grandfather's legacy. And I had worked for wonderful organizations that were working on cancer and other things. But through learning from him and understanding, the empathy for what was going on with humans, I don't think there's a greater cause than food. No child should ever die of malnutrition. They are innocent of their circumstances, and we need to do everything to ensure that children grow up with adequate food supply and are not stunted. And I think there's just nothing more calling than the issue of hunger, and it's something we can solve.
What are you doing exactly to ensure that the legacy of Norman Borlaug stays on?
Well, I do a multitude of things, but I work for the Borlaug Institute at Texas A&M, and we're primarily a development agency. We do development programs. We have partners that are within the United States, other universities, private sector partners, as well as in-country partners. So we've been in Rwanda, we've been in many places in Africa. So we always align ourselves with a university here, typically are funded by USAID or other entities of the U.S. government, and we do through development projects. So when we were in Rwanda, we worked on the coffee sector, and we worked from helping form the cooperatives to the growing conditions to the varieties all the way to access to market. So that's what we at the Borlaug Institute do, and that's just carrying my grandfather's belief that you had to create a viable agriculture sector. Then you could bring in the education and the infrastructure and the health, and they would grow the economy, and the agrarian society would grow. I also do a lot of speaking for my grandfather's legacy. All of the groups that are my grandfather's what we call legacy institutions. So here we're celebrating CIMMYT, which is the International Research Center for Wheat and Maize. I advocate for them. I help them with funding. I do that with many other organizations. I work closely with USAID. So I told him on his deathbed that I would be a voice. He asked me to continue to be a voice for his legacy. And
you are that voice?
I am that voice. I also promised him that I would advocate for the need of innovation and technology, especially in research for agriculture and the acceptance of it, but also support of the next generation. Because a lot of people don't realize the reason why the Green Revolution was successful was because my grandfather trained so many farmers and researchers from India and Pakistan. He actually trained them down in Mexico. And it was those young farmers and scientists who took a risk and were willing to take a risk and adopt a new innovation and also a new whole farming system and went back to their home countries and made the Green Revolution successful.
Yes, talking about the Norman Borlaug Institute, how are you teaching, for example, that farmer down there in order to enhance food security in the one?
So we like to be a holistic approach, and that means address everything along the value chain. In any program we are doing, we believe in the land-grant model of research, teaching, and extension. So really, extension is the most important thing we can do when we do a development project, and that means that the farmer is the ultimate goal for us. That any system we bring in, any innovation or technology, once we leave, the farmers and the group that we were working with can move forward and make it their own, and it will continue. So it's the whole thing of don't give them the fish, but teach them to fish.
Talking about stakeholders, you've talked about the farmer as a great stakeholder, obviously. What about those policymakers? Because we know that in order for agriculture to be successful, policies also have to be there. That is good policies. How do you advise these stakeholders that are very important, like governments?
Well, first and foremost, I'd ask them to go out and meet with the farmers before they ever put a policy together that will affect farmers. I was in Uganda a few years ago when there was talk about raising the fertilizer tax on farmers 20%. And that not only would decimate the smallholder farmer, but that would decimate the agrarian economy within Uganda. So before a minister or any political leader comes up with a policy that they might think is best, it's really important to go talk to the farmers, engage with the agrarian community, as well as the researchers and all of those to really come up with a sound policy, because ultimately it's the farmer who creates the success. And that's what we always need to be looking for. And my grandfather's last words were, take it to the farmer. So I always say, whatever you're doing, it needs to reach the farmer, but they need to be involved.
Norman Borlaug liked farmers so much.
You know, when he came and addressed global leaders or came to Kenya and met with the ministers and other high-level officials, what he wanted to do most was be in the field with the farmers. So he would get up early and have someone take him out. It might be 4 a.m. so he could spend time with the farmers. That was his passion. That was his, he was a scientist, he was a warrior against hunger, but he was a farmer at heart. Well, he was told he had 3 days left to live, and he didn't speak all day. And then we finally asked what we could do. Did he want to call his family? What did he need? And he said, Africa. I failed Africa. I never brought a green revolution to Africa, and I need 5 more years to try to do that. I quickly told him that you've trained hundreds and thousands of people, or you've inspired them to be your next generation hunger fighters. Millions. And inspired so many here in Africa who are going to take up the charge, and more importantly, who are going to train the next generation after them. So that's really his passion. And then, of course, his last words were, take it to the farmer. So he not only had Africa on his mind when he passed away, but it was take it to the farmer. And when he said take it to the farmer, it was in reference to a technology for smallholder farmers here in Africa.
Which technologies, for example?
The technology he was talking about was a handheld device that could check nitrogen levels for smallholder farmers. So it was inexpensive, but it could be useful for their application of fertilizers. So they were saving on the input cost, but also being environmentally appropriate with the application of fertilizer.
This is the Saturday morning interview. Today I'm speaking with Julie Borlaug, the granddaughter of the father of the 20th century Green Revolution that saved 1 billion lives from starvation. We are looking into possible ways to enhance food security, especially in Africa, considering that Kenya was recently host of the African Green Revolution Forum. So, since 2009, when your grandfather died, have you tried to take it to the farmer?
Yes, so every time I speak or every time I'm somewhere, I talk about the farmer. They're my passion. When I spoke at the Agra, I did the opening remarks earlier.
The AGRF.
The AGRF
Yes.
forum. Of course, I addressed all the government officials and important delegates, but then I asked all the farmers in the audience to stand up, and I asked that we honor them, and that I do that every single time because I think the audience needs to turn around and look and realize everything we're talking about is really about the farmer. And every opportunity I have, wherever I travel, I go out, as my grandfather did, and meet with the smallholder farmers, and I just tried to learn from them. I am not a scientist, I'm not an agricultural trained scientist, but I want to learn from them so I can speak about them and advocate for their needs.
When you go somewhere, for example, and people know that you're the granddaughter of Noman Borlaug, how do they receive you?
It gets a little embarrassing when they try to receive me as they would my grandfather. I always say, I am not my grandfather, I'm just a voice of his legacy. But it's honoring to see the role he played in their lives and the personal touches. I have learned from people all over the world that he was supportive of their children getting educations, and he wrote recommendation letters and followed up with the families to make sure their children's education was important, and to also see where the children and where the family ended up. So, his empathy and love for the farmers and those who needed a better life. And it was a better life we could achieve through agriculture production and yields and to grow the agribusiness sector.
Yes, in 1970, Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize because of his attitude towards a green revolution in the world, bringing peace. Now, in Africa, for example, there are many conflicts. How do you think issues of a green revolution in Africa can enhance peace and security?
Well, first and foremost, it isn't going to be a green revolution necessarily like my grandfather had in Asia. It's going to be more appropriate to the continent, but more specifically to each country and each region within a country. But I think it's so important because if you look at the most unstable countries around the world, they're the most food insecure. And as my grandfather said, when you're hungry and you live in misery and poverty, those are fertile seeds for ism. And, terrorism is one, or anything where you try to get food just to survive, but more importantly for your family. And that's when a peaceful, stable environment falls apart. So agriculture really is the first and foremost thing we need to address when we look at food insecurity, and even before it gets to a point that is critical, or even when we get to a point of a famine, if we had just addressed the agrarian economy and the society and helped develop it, we know will create a more stable, functioning, peaceful world.
Let me take you back again. There was the AGRF, as we mentioned earlier, and so many delegates came here, promised billions for agriculture in Africa. Do you think this promise will finally enhance food production in Africa?
Well, first I want to thank all of the ministers and heads of countries and everyone else who made a promise. But we have to remember it was a promise. And as my grandfather said, you cannot eat potential. So we need to make sure those commitments are followed through. But I think Africa is on the verge. But it has to be able to feed itself, to move into a middle income economy, to actually support all of those, to provide the education that every child deserves. So I think we have to get there, but it all goes back to all of these promises, whether it's from NGOs, university research, anything, we have to actually address it. And as my grandfather, if he'd been standing or had been at the AGRF, he probably would dismiss the audience and told them to go get in the fields and get the work done. So I think, and a lot of people brought this up, here we are, we know what Africa needs and what each country needs. Now let's just get it done.
You can't eat potential.
Yes, you cannot eat potential. You can make every promise in the world, but until you make good on that, it has no value.
And that reminds me of many declarations in Africa. For example, in 2003, governments promised to set aside 10% of their national budget for agricultural production. And that has not been done in Africa. Do you think these promises will one day come into fruition?
I hope. And it's for the good of each country. I mean, the government leaders need to realize if they really bolster agriculture and the agrarian communities, that creates a better society, that creates, on the economic end, that creates more GDP for each country. So it's so important. But I think what's most helpful is that the people need to tell their governments it's time to make good on the promises.
How do they tell their governments?
Well, we don't want to do conflict or anything like that, but I think, peacefully coming together and urging your government to make the situation better and to truly make the investments that are going to radically change the state of each country in Africa.
As we are winding up the Saturday morning interview, we know that your grandfather did great to this world, the Green Revolution. What about Julie? What is she going to achieve finally? What will people remember about Julie?
Well, I hope they realize that I'm an advocate for everyone involved in feeding the world. I hope to always be utilized to be a voice for each and every farmer, for each child who has experienced malnutrition or anyone or those who are stunted. I hope that I can just highlight that when I speak to people outside of agriculture, whether it's to global leaders, to organizations that can provide funding and help mobilize this movement. That's what I'd like. I would love more than anything that we never see a famine again. There is no purpose for a famine, and we essentially have one in areas like Somalia and other parts of Africa, and we just can't be guilty of that as a society, that we allow that to happen. So a goal for me is no more famines and just my goal is just to be a voice and an advocate for everyone who wants better and wants to end hunger and poverty.
And when Julie speaks, people listen.
Well, I hope I hope so. I come at it in a little different way. I personalize it, and I bring, some humor. And I can, because I'm his granddaughter, I can make some statements that are a little more edgy. But hopefully they go over okay. But I think, we need to look at agriculture differently. And when we speak to the public who are removed from agriculture, we need to do it in a way they understand so they will become part of this effort to really create change.
So finally, let me ask you probably a familiar question. So are other grandchildren of Norman Borlaug involved in agriculture also?
Unfortunately, they are not, which made me the favorite of my grandfather. No, I'm kidding. I have taken my son to see my grandfather's work in Mexico and to experience his wheat fields in the Yaqui Valley in Obregon, which were a love of my grandfather's. And I talked to him a lot about agriculture, and he just started school the other day. He's 7, but he started 2nd grade, and they asked them to write down what they wanted to be in the future. And I'm so proud that he wrote down he wanted to be a wheat scientist or a robot scientist, and he wanted to travel internationally and help people. So that's not exactly where I'd like him to be, but at least he's starting to understand the concept that we need another Borlaug involved in agriculture.
And we don't have many as of now.
No, we don't.
And with that, we come to the end of the Saturday morning interview. Today, I've been speaking with Julie Borlaug, the Associate Director, Borlaug Institute, External Relations in Texas, USA. Julie is the granddaughter of Noman Borlaug, the 1970 Nobel laureate and the father of the Green Revolution in the world that saved 1 billion people from starvation. Our focus has been the Borlaug Legacy to the world and lessons for Africa to enhance food productivity. My name is Geoffrey Onditi.